I want to bring in our guest, Neama Rahmani. He's a former federal prosecutor. Neama, what did you think or what did you make of this testimony being reread from that Galveston trial? Do you think it helps the prosecution's case, or does it take away from looking at the murder of Susan Berman?
And Jeanette, I understand why John Lewin is presenting this evidence to the jury. Well, we know why Kathy Durst's murder or disappearance is being presented. That's the motive for the Susan Berman killing. But Morris Black's a little bit more difficult, right? This is a case that was tried, obviously. As you said, Bob Durst was acquitted. I think even he was surprised when he was acquitted, frankly, because it was a very strong case, certainly much stronger than the Susan Berman case. But I think the reason Lewin is presenting it is as follows. You have a frail old man sitting there in a wheelchair, and I think some jurors are going to be sympathetic and question if he's capable of murder. And by discussing the Morris Black case and showing these jurors how this particular defendant was able to kill his neighbor, dismember his body, chop it up, throw it into the bay, that will show these jurors, at least circumstantially, that this is someone who is capable of killing his best friend, entering her home, shooting her in the back of the head, execution style, everything that relates to the Susan Berman case. So it does, again, dirty up Bob Durst just a bit, but I think we're spending a lot of time on Morris Black. And ultimately, if I were Lewin, and even though we're throwing everything into this case, right? I mean, we're talking about evidence that's, 20, sometimes 40 years old here that's being presented to this jury. If I were the prosecution, I would maybe try to tighten it up, especially this Morris Black evidence, and not present absolutely everything. Because again, you don't want to lose these jurors.
Yeah, definitely. And as you could see while you were talking, Neama, we saw the camera kind of pan up to the ceiling. That is a sign that the court is going on a break. One thing that we discussed last week that I thought was pretty interesting, Bob Durst, in that testimony, talked about learning of the death of his friend Susan Berman, the murder of Susan Berman. And that account is going to differ greatly from what Bob Durst is likely going to get up on the stand and say. He conceded, he stipulated right before the trial that he found Susan Berman's body. He wrote the cadaver note. It would seem like he thought there was no way he couldn't get around that. So he has a story to tell, but that story is going to differ from what he said on the stand back in the year 2003. Is that part of the reason we're hearing this testimony, in your opinion?
I think so. There's not a whole lot of direct evidence in the Susan Berman case, right? One is the statements that were made during the jinx, and obviously the defense is going to argue that those were edited, and if you play the full recording on the hot mic, it's going to say something different. And really, the other direct evidence in the Susan Berman murder is a cadaver note. And I think at this point, Bob Durst is going to have to admit that he wrote that note, and the defense does have to admit that because it's clearly the same writing and the same misspelling of Beverly and everything that has already been discussed. So one thing Bob Durst is not afraid to do is to take the stand and to give interviews, whether it's the Jinx or to Lewin directly or during the Morris Black case. So we know he's going to testify in this trial related to the death of Susan Berman. The defense has already said that in both openings. And I think this is something that he's going to have to embrace and say, he got scared. He stumbled upon the body. He thought he was going to be a suspect, and that's why he sent the letter that he did. So it's going to be fascinating because we know it's going to happen, but when it happens, to hear Bob Durst's testimony in this case.
Yeah, and he seems very adamant about testifying. He even mentioned it in the last week or two, and he's ready to do it. He's ready to get up there, and he has a story to tell. So we have much more to discuss, of course, with this case. There are endless number of things we could discuss with this case. It's just never ending.
But I do feel I let her down. I look back at that last 2 months and I go, what could I have done differently?
Bill Stevenson, a man who claims to have had an affair, a brief affair with Kathy Durst right before she disappeared in 1982. And he was alleging some very odd and violent behavior towards Kathy Durst at times. So, Neama, let me ask you about this again. This seems really consistent with some of the other things we've heard from Kathy Durst's friends at trial, in this trial. So again, I mean, it just seems odd to me if they know about this out in LA that they wouldn't have called this man to testify. Or is it possible if they did know about him that they just think they don't need it?
Frankly, I think Lewin didn't know about it because it's helpful for his case, and it's someone who's been living, breathing the Bob Durst investigation for so many years. It's possible that, frankly, he just missed this particular witness. Again, there was that report in the 80s to law enforcement, but it's a question of whether a report was made and there were records of this encounter. Obviously, Stevenson's saying there is. I don't think that Lewin and the DA's office have any reports from NYPD related to this particular witness because, believe me, he is helpful. What he says is good for the state's case. So I fully expect Lewin to somehow try to backdoor him in, again, through rebuttal, not in their case in chief. I fully expect DeGuerin and Durst's defense team to try to in-limb to keep him off from testifying, saying that this is something that the prosecution should have known about. They should have disclosed this. So we're likely going to see some law in motion with respect to this particular witness. But again, unless there's something I'm missing, and this interview was pretty comprehensive, I would expect the prosecution to want him to testify in this case.
So, Neama, what kind of goes through your mind? I want to bring you back in to talk about this. What goes through your mind when you hear Bob Durst? Obviously, we're hearing his words. And I think the demeanor is probably pretty similar from what we've heard of the testimony from the Jinx, the yes, sir, the no, sir, all of that stuff. Just kind of nonchalantly talking about going, wanting to roll up the body in the drop cloth. Well, then he couldn't do it because, it's too heavy, and going to get a fifth of Jack Daniels and starting to drink it, and recalling this whole process about getting rid of a body. How does this play so many years later in front of this jury in Los Angeles?
Angie, I'm smiling, even though we're talking about a murder and a cover-up of that murder ultimately was found to be in self-defense. But what's fascinating testimony, and how cool is it for these law students? I mean, they're involved in the trial of the century, maybe the trial of 2 centuries, because it spans back to the early 80s, to be involved directly reading back this testimony. But this is classic Bob Durst. This is how he is. He's going to be he's going to get up there and he's going to talk, and he's going to talk for hours. And the defense is going to argue that this is Bob Durst being honest. He's going to say honestly stumbled across his best friend. She was shot in the head, and he thought he would be a suspect, but he cared about her and wanted her body to be found. And that's why he sent that letter to Beverly Hills PD. And the state, we know what they're going to argue. They're going to argue that this is a killer who thinks he can get away with everything. And they've talked about shoplifting on the sort of minor side to 3 murders to the more serious. So I think it's going to cut in both directions. But here's someone who has at least one time talked his way out of a murder, and he was never charged with the disappearance of his wife. So the question is it going to be 3 for 3, or is it going to be 3 strikes and you're out for Bob Durst?
Yeah, that is the question, and whether or not he'll be as convincing. Obviously, it's going to be a much different Bob Durst now. The voice is much different. It's because he's had that cancer of the esophagus. He sounds much weaker. He's probably not going to sound the same, but we'll just have to wait and see.
I like those comments for the prosecution, the fact that, when the Jinx comes out, he doesn't deny murdering these people. He just says, look, I think I'm in trouble. I think that's helpful for the state here, and I see why they want her on the stand. We're going to hear 3 hours of testimony here, but I think that was the key part that the state really wanted to get out. Blood evidence was not consistent with a violent death. And again, I don't think that's something the prosecution is going to refute. They came back during cross-examination and scored some points saying, look, obviously we knew that Dylan died from blunt force trauma, and that if there was one strike that caused Dylan's death, we wouldn't expect to see a lot of blood. And that's something that Eichlin Bloom did admit to. So again, he did score some points for the defense here, but again, not inconsistent with the state's theory of the case, because the state didn't argue that there was massive amounts of blood or that there was a cleanup and the blood sort of spread everywhere. So I think that regardless of this testimony, I think the state is still significantly ahead in this case.
Testimony about a lack of blood in certain locations, and they talked about the pickup truck, that there was no evidence of a violent death or a body being transported that he could find in that truck. That was Mark Redwine's truck. And they also talked about this whole Nerf football thing, which is kind of an important point. Mark Redwine, in a statement to the FBI, kind of his story kind of changed a little bit. He apparently said at first that Dylan had not been injured while visiting him, but then later on in the interview said that there was a football that they were tossing and that Dylan was hit in the face with that football, and he began bleeding and spitting some blood from the mouth and things like that. And that came later on in that statement. So, Neama, let's talk a little bit about this testimony. Just because there's no evidence right now of, a bloody mess, left over from a possible homicide, what weight do you think that the jury is going to give this evidence that we don't have all this blood just laying all over the place and we have these small amounts of DNA?
And Jeanette, I don't think it gets the defense very far because the state isn't arguing that this was a bloody massacre. And I think you nailed it. A lot of the evidence in this case is going to be circumstantial, right? What would a father be expected to do when his son disappears? And would his story be expected to change? First, there was no discussion of injury. Then there was a cold sore. And when the agent confronts him and says, well, I'm going to call his mom, he says, well, no, there was no cold sore. We were roughhousing and I threw this football and it hit his lip, and that's what caused the blood. But, I think what Eklund ignored was all the other evidence, right? The evidence of the blunt force trauma, right? Which could have, and according to the state's theory, did cause Dylan's death. What about Molly the cadaver dog that alerted to the trunk of the vehicle? Again, that evidence was ignored. So by focusing narrowly on this blood issue, I think the defense, and again, their case certainly isn't over yet, but they ignored all the other evidence that the state has presented over the past couple of weeks that has nothing to do with blood, that leads to a conclusion that Dylan was killed using some sort of blunt instrument with respect to his skull, his body dismembered, scattered miles apart, and ultimately that was consistent with a murder and not him walking out of the house and being attacked by animals, which is the defense theory.
To discuss this, Neama, we aren't hearing that Mark Redwine made any denials. Like, what are you talking about? This is my son. I didn't do anything to my son. We're hearing that he is saying during the course of this interview, the last thing he says is, I have to think about myself. What does that tell you?
That's terrible for Redwine in his defense. We know the state's theory of this case, that this is not your typical father-son relationship. And that's what they led on. They opened with the pictures of Mark picking up Dylan at the airport, the video, and then the video of them together at the Walmart. Because what the jurors are asking themselves? Why would a father kill his own son? How is this even possible? So the jurors are looking for evidence of what would I do if my child went missing. I certainly wouldn't take a nap like Mark Redwine did. I wouldn't change my story over the course of 3 interviews like Mark Redwine did. I wouldn't provide a pillow that's the wrong pillow to the dogs that are looking for your son, and evidence of that has and will come out. And I certainly wouldn't say that I need to think about myself when my 12-year-old son is missing. So this is all really bad evidence for the defense and why I expect a guilty verdict in this case.
Yeah, it just doesn't. I've said this the whole time. Whether or not you think the state's case is incredibly strong or not, his behavior is not typical. I don't care how stoic you are. Your child goes missing on your watch on a court-ordered visit. You're the last person to see him, and this is how you play it. It seems very bizarre. Very quickly, Neama.
Yeah, very bizarre, and it's something the jury is not going to like, and something that's a strength that the prosecution is consistently playing on, and I think something that they're going to argue in summation. I don't care what the forensics are, lack of physical evidence. This is not a father that has an innocent state of mind, a father who cares about his missing son, and a father that should be found not guilty. That's why you should return a guilty verdict.
All right, we're going to wait to see how it plays out. The trial resumes tomorrow morning in Colorado against Mark Redwine. Also, the Bob Durst trial will be underway again. Neama, thanks for joining us tonight, and thank you for joining us. I'm Anjanette Levy. You've been watching Night Court on the Law and Crime Trial Network.